night was cold and silent, with only the occasional sound of wind passing through the trees of the old cemetery. David Grayson, a man in his 40s, newly hired as a night gravedigger, was on his first shift. He needed the job. After months of being unemployed and struggling to pay the bills, he had seized the opportunity, even though the job was strange and isolated. The cemetery was located on the outskirts of a small town in the countryside. It was surrounded by an ancient stone wall, with moss covering the lower parts, and a rusty iron gate that creaked whenever it was moved. David parked his old truck next to the tool house, where the night watch would begin. At first, the work seemed simple. He needed to patrol the grounds, make sure nothing out of the ordinary happened, and occasionally carry out minor repairs on tombstones and graves. The supervisor had left clear instructions. Avoid approaching the old crypt on the west side. The ground there is unstable. David found the alert strange, but did not question. He began his round with a powerful lantern in hand. The tombstones were scattered throughout the area, some so old that the names were erased. As he walked, he felt the weight of silence, only broken by the sound of his own footsteps crushing the dry leaves on the ground. Soon, something peculiar caught his attention. In one of the most remote areas, next to a row of ancient graves, the earth seemed to have been recently removed. The ground was darker and looser, as if someone had dug there and then tried to cover the hole anyway. David bent down, examining the place carefully. Perhaps they have done a recent burial, he thought, trying to calm himself. However, something was wrong. There were no fresh flowers or sign of any recent ceremony, and the name on the tombstone was of a person who had died more than 50 years ago. He decided to ignore it. It was his first shift, and he did not want to imagine things. He continued the patrol, but restlessness remained with him. In 2 more graves, he saw similar signs. Earth scrambled, as if something had come out or tried to enter there. As he returned to the tool house for a break, David lit a cigarette and tried to dispel the feeling of discomfort. The wind outside seemed stronger now, as if something was moving along with it. He looked at the clock. 1 a.m. Still had long hours ahead. While he was smoking, an idea crossed his mind. Perhaps they are animals. That made sense. Raccoons or wild dogs could have dug the earth. But still, why only on such old graves? And why in various parts of the cemetery? The old house radio tuned, emitting a hiss before a melancholy music filled the environment. David sat down in the chair, trying to distract himself. However, outside, the sound of the wind seemed lower now, almost muffled. There was a new sound, something light and irregular, as if dry leaves were being trampled. He put out the cigarette and left again with the flashlight, focusing the beam of light in the direction where the noise was coming from. Nothing, just tombstones in rows and trees swaying softly. Breathing deeply, David returned to the inside, determined to ignore it. While recording his observations in the control book, he felt that the air in the house seemed denser, heavier. He didn't know why, but felt something was watching him, even if he rationally told himself it was just his imagination. Thus ended his first night, with the strange impression that although he was alone in the cemetery, he was not the only present there. By the second week of work, David was getting used to the routine. The nights were long and lonely, but he liked silence. There was something almost meditative in walking among the ancient tombstones, illuminated only by the moonlight and the beam of his lantern. Still, the images of the churned graves did not leave his mind. That night, the wind was colder, and a light mist began to appear, enveloping the farthest tombstones. As he walked the main paths of the cemetery, David heard something unusual. At first, it sounded like the wind passing through the trees, but as you approached a less frequented area, the sound became sharper. They were whispers, weak, almost inaudible. He stopped, pointing the lantern around. Nothing. The sound seemed to come from below, from the depths of the earth. David stood still, his ears open, trying to decipher what he was hearing. It was as if several voices were speaking at the same time, in a low and monotonous tone, in a language he did not recognize. "It must be the wind," he muttered, trying to convince himself. He continued walking, but the whispers seemed to follow him, growing and diminishing in intensity, as if they were moving under the ground. At one point, the sound suddenly ceased, leaving a heavy silence in the air. David felt a shiver run through his spine. He tried to ignore it and go on with his rounds. Passing through a row of ancient tombs, he noticed something peculiar. A tombstone was overturned, as if it had been pushed. The surrounding land seemed once again to be disturbed. David knelt down to examine the site, but as he touched the ground, he felt something strange. The earth was warm. "But what the hell?" he said, removing his hand quickly. David took a step back, and his foot stepped on something soft. He turned the lantern down and saw a small cloth doll, dirty and worn, with eyes sewn of buttons. It should not be there. He took it, analyzing it under the light of the lantern, and noticed that the doll was wet, as if it had been recently buried. Feeling a mixture of discomfort and curiosity, he decided to take the doll to the tool house. As soon as he entered, he put it on the table and sat down, taking a deep breath. But before he could relax, he heard again the whispers, now closer, almost inside the house. He stood up, jumping, the lantern shaking in his hand. He pointed to all corners, but there was no one there. The sound seemed to come from the doll. He picked up the object carefully, but silence returned instantly. "I'm going crazy," he thought, trying to convince himself that everything was the fruit of his tired mind. Left the doll in a corner of the table and went out to breathe the cold night air. Outside, the silence was disturbing. Neither the wind, nor the crickets, nor any other common sound were present. Just the occasional rustling of trees in the distance. David felt uncomfortable, as if he was being watched again. When he turned to go back to the house, he noticed something strange. Footprints on the ground, going from the direction of the tombs to his hut. Small footprints, barefoot like a child. He followed the marks with the flashlight, trying to understand where they came from. But the footprints simply disappeared halfway, as if the person had vanished into thin air. A shiver took him completely. Inside the house, he heard something fall. Ran inside and found the cloth doll lying on the floor, far from the table where he had left it. David felt his heart racing. He was sure something was going on in that cemetery, something he could not explain. And for the first time, he wondered if the supervisor knew more about that place than he had told. The next night, David arrived at the cemetery more tense than usual. He had spent the day thinking about strange events, but refused to believe that something supernatural was involved. "There must be a logical explanation," he repeated to himself. The weather was heavier that night, with the sky covered by dense clouds that hid the moon. David's lantern seemed less efficient, its light scattered by the mist that spread between the tombstones. He felt the cold of the humidity in the air as he walked through the graves, avoiding looking at the area where he had found the doll the night before. As he advanced, the silence of the cemetery was broken by a sound that he did not expect. Laughter. Weak, distant, but clearly laughing. It was a low and irregular laugh, as if someone was mocking him. "Is anyone there?" David shouted, trying to sound confident. His voice echoed through the cemetery, but received no response. He followed the direction of the sound, crossing a more distant area where the tombstones were older and poorly cared. The laughter ceased, but something new caught his attention. In the mist, he saw a still silhouette, a dark figure, standing between the graves. David froze, heart pounding. The figure did not move. He pointed the lantern at her, but the light seemed to be swallowed by the mist before it reached her. "Hey, who's there?" He yelled again, his voice now trembling. The figure remained still for a few more seconds, before slowly starting to move away, walking into the mist. David hesitated, but decided to follow her, believing it could be an invader. His job, after all, was to protect the cemetery. He ran, trying to reach the silhouette, but the further he went, the more it seemed to move away. The sound of his own footsteps on the wet ground was muffled by the mist, and he soon realized that he was far away from the main area of the cemetery. It was then that he stopped suddenly. The silhouette was no longer there. Instead, he noticed other forms around him. Not just one, but several. Small, medium, high, all standing still, motionless, watching from within the mist. David felt the panic grow. His instinct was to run away, but his legs seemed to be stuck to the ground. The figures did not move, but he could feel his eyes, or whatever they had in their place, fixed on him. Trying to keep calm, he took one step back, then another. As soon as he did, the figures began to move slowly, their movements clumsy, as if they were learning to walk. David turned and ran. The sound of his steps echoed through the cemetery, and he heard something more behind him. The sound of feet dragging, as if the figures were chasing him. Arriving at the tool shed, he slammed the door with force, locking it with trembling hands. He leaned against the wall, panting, while silence reigned again outside. But it was not safe. Outside, in the fog-covered window, he saw a mark. A small hand, like that of a child, sliding slowly through the glass. David backed away, his heart beating so fast it seemed like it was going to explode. He had no more doubts. Something was happening in that cemetery. Something that did not belong to this world. And now he did not know how to escape. David spent the rest of the night locked in the tool shed, his eyes fixed on the window, waiting for something or someone to try to get in. But to his surprise, the house remained untouched. When the sun finally began to rise on the horizon, the figures disappeared, taking with them the mist and whispers. Tired but determined, David went to the supervisor in the morning. He wanted answers. "I need to know, Joe, what the hell is going on in this cemetery?" He demanded without hiding his exhaustion. Joe, a gray-haired man with few words, faced David with a heavy expression. For a moment, he seemed to be debating with himself whether he should tell anything. Finally, he sighed. "You're not the first to ask this, nor will you be the last. But if you want to stay here, you better stop asking questions." "That's not enough," David hit back, frustrated. "Last night I saw things. People, shadows, I don't know what they were. And I heard voices, laughter, as if someone was surrounding me." Joe didn't answer immediately. He walked to his desk, opened a drawer and took out an old map from the cemetery. He unfolded it on the table and pointed to a secluded area at the far south of the field. "Have you been here?" David looked at the map and recognized the location. It was where he saw the first figure in the fog. He nodded. "They should have blocked this area, but no one dares to come close to do it. Since I started here, they always said that place was different. It is where the oldest graves are, even before the cemetery was made official." "Different how?" Joe hesitated, but finally answered, "Some things should not be buried, and what is down there never rests." David felt a shiver run through his spine. Joe handed him a small wooden cross and muttered, "Take it with you if you insist on going on. But if I were you, I'd leave now." David left the office with more questions than answers. He could not simply leave his job, but something inside him was pushing him to return to the place that Joe had indicated. Something in that area seemed to call him, as if he needed to find out what was happening. That night, armed with the cross and his lantern, David decided to face his fears. He went to the isolated area of the cemetery, where the tombstones were worn by time and poorly legible. The silence there was denser, as if the air itself were heavy. As he approached one of the oldest graves, he noticed something strange on the ground. There was a crack in the earth, as if the ground had been forced to open. The smell of wet earth and something more pungent, almost acrid, invaded his nostrils. David knelt and pointed his flashlight at the crack. He saw something shining down there, something metallic and strange. Without thinking, he started digging with his hands. The deeper he dug, the deeper it seemed to be. Finally, his fingers touched something cold. He removed a small and heavy object, an old, worn-out medallion. Engraved on it was a symbol that David did not recognize, but which looked uncomfortably familiar. As soon as he held the locket, the whispers began again, this time louder and more distinct. The voices were not just murmurs. They seemed to scream in agony, mixed with shrill laughter. David backed away, the locket still in his hand. The ground under his feet began to shake slightly, and he felt something move under the earth as if he were alive. Suddenly, he heard a sound that froze his blood. The scratch of nails against wood, coming from below where he was standing. He released the medallion and ran. The whispers followed him, growing in intensity like a wave that surrounded him. Reaching the tool house, he locked the door and looked at his hands. They were covered with dirt and blood. The locket was somehow back in his pocket. David felt a presence behind him, but when he turned around there was no one. Only the cloth doll, now sitting on the table, with her head slightly tilted, as if she was watching him. David spent the rest of the night inside the tool house, fighting with fear and fatigue. The locket in his pocket seemed to weigh tons, radiating an energy he could not explain. The doll remained on the table, inert, but its mere presence was suffocating. When the first rays of sun came, David left the house. The cemetery was again calm, as if nothing had happened, but he knew that he could not ignore what he had witnessed. Determining that he needed to understand the meaning of the locket and the events of the cemetery, David went to the small local library. There he searched for historical records about the cemetery and found an old dusty book entitled Mysteries and Local Curses. In the book, David read about the south area of the cemetery where the figures in the fog had appeared. In the past, this place was a forbidden land, used for occult rituals performed by a group of settlers who believed in dark practices to achieve immortality. They said that they buried their victims alive, believing that the energy of the dead would protect them. An excerpt from the book caught his attention. They say that an artifact was created as an anchor to hold the souls trapped in the place. Whoever finds him will be cursed, carrying the burden of his existence between the worlds. David felt the locket in his pocket. His heart popped as he realized that he was attached to something much bigger than he could have imagined. Even with fear dominating every fiber of his body, David knew he needed to return the locket. Perhaps that would calm the cemetery's presence. He returned to the scene at night, aware that decision could be his last. The wind seemed sharper, and the sky was so dark that even the stars dared to shine. When he arrived at the isolated area, the fog began to form, and the whispers returned. "I brought it back," cried David, holding the locket with a trembling hand. "I don't want anything to do with you." The voices increased, now clearly distinct, as if multiple people were around them, shouting incomprehensible words. The earth under his feet trembled, and the ground began to give way. David tried to back down, but felt something grab his ankle. He looked down and saw a pale, dead hand emerging from the ground. He fought, kicking, but soon other hands began to come up, trying to pull him down. In the middle of the chaos, a figure of a child appeared in the mist. It was the same little girl he saw before, now more visible. His eyes were black as emptiness, and his expression was of deep sadness. "You should not have touched the locket," she said, with a low and cold voice, completely misaligned from her appearance. David tried to scream, but his hands kept dragging him to the ground. He felt the cold earth rise up to his knees. The medallion burned in his hand, and a desperate idea came to his mind. Bury it again. With his last strength, David threw the locket into the crack in the ground and muttered a quick prayer. For a moment, everything stopped. Silence reigned again. The hands disappeared, The mist dissipated, and David fell back, exhausted and terrified. He looked around, but there was no sign of the little girl or the figures. Only the medallion, again in sight, resting on the ground as if he mocked his effort. David knew at that moment that it would not end so easily. David spent the next few days in a state of constant alertness. He tried to act as if his life was normal, but the events in the cemetery followed him like a persistent shadow. The whispers, previously restricted to the night, began to invade his mind even during the day. The feeling of being observed never abandoned him, and he woke up every night with terrible nightmares of being buried alive. The locket somehow always came back to him. No matter how much he tried to discard it by burying, throwing in rivers, or even burning, it reappeared. David began to understand that he was irrevocably attached to the object. Desperately seeking help, he decided to visit a priest in the local church. Father Thomas was an experienced man, known for dealing with cases of spiritual disturbances. Hearing the account of David, the priest was silent, his face visibly worried. "David, this object carries a weight that surpasses this world. It is not just a medallion. It is a link, a key that holds souls to eternal suffering. What do I do? How do I get rid of it?" David begged. The priest hesitated before answering. "You can't get rid of it, but maybe you can placate the spirits. For that, you have to face the epicenter of everything." The priest explained that the locket should be returned to the point where the original ritual took place. This place, according to legends, would be an ancient forgotten mausoleum in the southern end of the cemetery. But there was a risk. Opening the passage could release something even more terrible. That night, armed with the cross the priest gave him and a desperate courage, David returned to the cemetery. He followed the priest's map to the mausoleum, a structure decayed and covered by eros, almost hidden by vegetation. As the heavy door opened, a smell of rot struck him, and a thick darkness enveloped him. Inside was a stone altar, stained by time and possibly the blood of victims of ancient rituals. David placed the medallion on the altar. The instant he did, the door of the mausoleum closed with a bang, and the shadows around him came to life. Pale and distorted figures began to form, their faces disfigured by suffering. "You brought us back," whispered a female voice, accompanied by a chorus of laments. David held the cross tightly and began to pray, but the figures did not back down. Instead, the floor of the mausoleum began to crack, revealing an abysmal darkness that seemed alive. The little girl appeared once again, now with an expression of agony and anger. "You should never have interfered," he cried, his voice reverberating like thunder. David realized he couldn't just abandon the locket. He was the only one who could stop it from escaping to the outside world. With a last act of courage, he held the medallion and threw himself into the abyss that opened under the altar. As he fell, he saw the figures around him disappear, their cries turning into murmurs of relief. The floor of the mausoleum closed slowly, and the cemetery was again silent. Days later, Supervisor Joe found the tool shed empty. David had disappeared without a trace. All that remained was the priest's cross, resting on the table next to the cloth doll. Something was different, however. The doll now had her eyes sewn with black lines, and a small disturbing smile adorned her face. Some say that during the misty nights, you can still hear David's voice echoing through the cemetery, begging for help. Others believe that he has become one more of the souls who now roam restlessly, forever stuck to the place where it all began. The locket has never been seen again, but its curse remains, waiting for the next unfortunate who dares to dig too deep into the cursed ground. Lucas was always a pragmatic young man, without much patience for the local legends or mysteries that involved small towns in the countryside. When he received the job offer as a gravedigger at Saints' Rest Cemetery, he thought it would be just another simple job. The city, a secluded and seemingly quiet place, seemed to be the perfect refuge for someone who wanted to leave the hustle and bustle of urban life behind. He arrived in the city on a gray morning, the sky full of clouds that announced a storm that seemed never to arrive. The city center was small, with narrow streets and low buildings, many of which seemed to be there since the last century. Lucas immediately noticed the peculiar silence that hovered in the air. People did not greet each other in the streets, and the few residents seemed to be laden with a silent melancholy. The cemetery, in turn, was a little away from the city on top of a hill. The entrance was a large wrought iron door, with fine details in the form of dry leaves and branches, which curved inward as if they were trying to embrace the gate. The access road was winding and lined by tall, dense trees that seemed to whisper something to anyone passing through. Lucas did not care much about the details. All he wanted was to start his work immediately. Upon arrival, he met an elderly man, Mr. Harold, the cemetery manager. He didn't talk much, but he seemed to have a quiet wisdom that made Luke uncomfortable. The old gravedigger received him without much ceremony, only indicating where the tools were and how to care for the oldest graves. "It's a quiet job," said Mr. Harold, with a whispered voice, "but you'd better pay attention to the shadows. They do not follow the light." Lucas frowned, not understanding. But Mr. Harold had already turned and headed for the gate. During the first days, Luke began to explore the cemetery. The tombstones were old and worn, many covered with moss and with names almost erased. There was an air of oblivion, as if time had stopped between the tombs, making the place a forgotten memory. He quickly got used to the silence that surrounded the place, but what drew his attention was the shadows that formed around the tombstones. No matter the angle he looked at, the light from the cemetery lamps seemed to not reach certain points of the ground, as if something was trying to avoid lighting. The job was simple: bury the bodies and keep the graves in order. However, every night Lucas began to notice something strange. The shadows seemed to move in an inexplicable way. As he approached a gravestone to lay the earth, the ground seemed to sink slightly, as if something was being pulled down, but there was no sign of life on the site. One day, while cleaning a particularly old tombstone, he felt a shiver in his spine, as if being observed. He turned around, but saw nothing. Only the empty cemetery, the vegetation that moved softly with the breeze. Even so, a feeling of discomfort remained with him, like an invisible pressure, as if he was being watched by something that he could not see. "It's just paranoia," thought Lucas, trying to convince himself. "There are no such things as shadows that move on their own. That's the thing of people's heads here." But when night fell and he was alone in the cemetery again, he could not get away from the feeling. The shadows seemed denser, darker, and he felt as if the place was breathing with him, in a rhythm almost imperceptible. He then remembered Mr. Harold's words, "Shadows do not follow light," and for the first time Luke wondered if what the old man was trying to tell him was more than just superstition. Perhaps there, in the heart of that cemetery, the shadows were not just shadows. With the wind hissing through the trees and the surrounding silence, Lucas felt he was about to discover something far beyond reason. And that night, the place seemed farther from any kind of reality than he could have ever imagined. In the following days, the atmosphere in the cemetery became increasingly oppressive. Lucas tried to keep calm, but he could not get away with the feeling that something was wrong. The shadows continued to move in strange ways, far from the areas illuminated by the lamps. When he approached a tomb or crouched to settle the earth, felt that something was watching him, but looking back, there was no one. The silence, once so comforting, now became suffocating. On the third night, something different happened. Lucas was doing his usual round, checking the oldest graves, when he began to hear a low whisper, like a murmur coming from the direction of one of the more distant tombstones at the bottom of the cemetery. He stopped, trying to locate the source of the sound, but there was not enough wind to move the trees, and the sound seemed to come from a formless place, as if the air itself was talking. He frowned, convinced that it could be some animal or perhaps a distant echo. However, as the whisper intensified, he realized that the words were not random. They seemed directed to him, low and dragged, as if they were spoken by a muffled voice. "You are here." The feeling of cold ran through his spine, and he turned quickly, trying to locate the origin of the voice. There was nothing, only the emptiness and deep silence of the cemetery. The whisper stopped abruptly, leaving Lucas tense and with a heart racing. He forced a nervous laugh, trying to convince himself that it was just his mind playing tricks, but the feeling of being observed only increased. He continued his rounds, but something looked different that night. The cemetery was darker than ever, and the path between the tombstones seemed longer, more labyrinthine. He felt that he was not alone. When he passed near a tomb, a metallic and warm smell of fresh earth struck him. But as he looked down, the ground was intact, as if nothing had been moved. He felt a shiver all over his body, but ignored it, telling himself that perhaps it was fear taking over. But when he reached the oldest part of the cemetery, what he saw made him stop instantly. A headstone, which he had never noticed before, was lit by a lonely lamp. The stone was broken, covered with moss and dirt, and the name engraved on it was obscured, almost unreadable. However, something was strange. There was no earth around the tombstone, as if it were being held up by an invisible force. Luke approached, feeling the pressure increase as he approached the stone. Suddenly he heard a muffled sound, like a murmur coming from inside the tombstone. He took a step back, feeling a weight on his chest. The shadows around seemed to grow, stretch and writhe as if they were taking shape. He touched the stone, and the murmur ceased instantly. He looked around. Nothing, only the silent graveyard. But something was wrong. The shadows were no longer static. They seemed to have life of their own, moving independently from the light sources, floating between the tombstones, distorted and irregular. Lucas felt that there was something there, something he should not be, watching it carefully. Feeling an inexplicable need to leave from there, he returned to the entrance of the cemetery, but the way seemed longer. The air seemed denser, and each step he took further away from the sense of security. When he finally reached the entrance, the full moon suddenly appeared, illuminating the land around him with a bright white light. Luke looked back. The cemetery now seemed even more gloomy, more oppressive. He went to the gate, feeling relieved that he was finally outside those borders. But something in the back of his mind did not leave him alone. The feeling that the cemetery was alive, that the shadows there were not common, could not be ignored. He had a strange feeling that whatever was there, he was no longer interested in just watching it. Something or someone wanted more. When he entered his house, a small cottage at the end of the street, the phone rang. Lucas hesitated for a moment before picking up the device, feeling a shiver at the sound of the line. "Luke," a deep, dragged voice whispered from the other side. He stood still, listening to the silence for a moment. But when the voice continued, his words seemed so real, so close, that he could almost feel them on his skin. "You can't leave. You belong to us." Lucas couldn't sleep that night. The sound of his voice whispering his name still echoed in his ears, reverberating sinister. He knew that it was not just a trick of his mind. There was something real and palpable in that whisper. He felt that somehow he was being dragged into the cemetery, like a puppet attached to invisible wires. The next day, he tried to convince himself that the cemetery was just messing with his head. Talking to himself and keeping rationality was all he could do, not give in to fear. But deep down, something was changing. He felt there was a pressure, an invisible presence that watched him all the time. Something that wanted him to be part of that place. He returned to work the next afternoon, the feeling of discomfort growing inside him with every step he took toward that gloomy hill. The cemetery looked denser that day, as if it was waiting for him. The trees on the roadside were taller, more closed, and the wind blew differently, carrying with it a smell of damp earth and something else, something nauseous. Upon arriving, he noticed that Mr. Harold was back, but he did not look the same. The old man was staring at something far away, not reacting to the presence of Luke. He looked paler, with tired eyes, as if he was fighting something inside. When Lucas greeted him, Mr. Smith said that he had been in a hurry. Harold was slow to respond, as if he was waking from a trance. "You heard the whispers, did you?" Mr. Harold asked, his voice broken, almost inaudible. Luke stopped, perplexed. "How do you know that?" The old gravedigger looked at him, and something in Harold's eyes made Lucas feel a chill. "They start like this, the shadows, the whispers, but then they get you." Luke felt a growing tension in his chest. He didn't want to hear more, but at the same time something pushed him to continue. Who are they?" he asked, the voice trembling, despite trying to keep calm. Mr. Harold looked down at the ground and then pointed slowly to the center of the cemetery, where an ancient tombstone stood among the others. It looked different from the others, not only because it was larger and more worn, but also by the way the light seemed to escape it, as if it had an aura of darkness that could not be penetrated. "They are there," said the old man, the voice now almost inaudible. "They speak to you, they call you, and when you can't resist anymore, you stay here. Forever." Lucas felt a chill through his spine. "Forever, forever," the old man repeated, as if it were the last breath of a lost soul. As Luke watched the headstone, he felt the wind rise from somewhere inside the cemetery. The trees swung violently, and the heavy silence of the place was broken by a distant sound like a whisper, or perhaps a low laugh. He turned quickly, looking for the source of the sound, but saw nothing. "You need to get out of here," said Mr. Harold with a look that mixed fear and despair, "before they come after you." But something inside Lucas did not let him go. An invisible force seemed to hold him there, as if the cemetery had already cast its claws upon him in an invisible way. He felt that he could not just leave, as if he had been marked in some way, as if the place itself had begun to enter his mind. In the following days, Lucas's behavior began to change. He was going to the cemetery with a feeling of irresistible attraction, as if the whispers, the voice, the cemetery itself called him. He could not help it. It was like an inner need, a drive. More and more, he spent whole nights wandering between the tombstones, always towards that which the old man had pointed, that one tombstone that seemed to stand out from the others. And the whisper continued. He no longer just whispered his name. Now the words were clearer, more urgent. "Luke, come to us." That night, Luke decided to go to the tombstone. I didn't know why he felt like going, but he couldn't resist anymore. The wind was strong, and the trees seemed to form a path, as if inviting him. When he reached the tombstone, something strange happened. The air was cold. The sound of the leaves swaying was muffled, as if the sound of the outside world had stopped completely. The shadows around began to move, writhing and stretching as if they were approaching him. He crouched before the stone, looking at the details worn out in the stone. The name was almost completely erased, but it was still possible to see some letters, torn by time. Something was there, something that should not be. The feeling that the place was alive, that the cemetery breathed with it, was now an unshakable certainty. Suddenly he heard the whisper again, louder than ever. "Luke, come in." He looked at the bottom of the cemetery, where a dark figure seemed to be waiting for him, standing between the trees. Luke's eyes narrowed. He knew not to come near. He knew he was making a terrible mistake. But still, he could not move. The figure came closer, the steps muffled by the grass, and the whisper intensified, until it turned into a low laugh, almost animal, as if feeding on his fear. And then he felt a presence by his side, something cold and heavy, like an invisible touch. Lucas had no control. The cemetery was consuming him, and he no longer knew what was real and what was not. The whisper increased, and the figure before him approached slowly. There was no turning back. Lucas was paralyzed, his heart beating so hard that he seemed to want to escape from the chest. The figure in front of him now approached slowly, As if floating, the steps made no noise, but he could feel her presence, heavy and suffocating. He could not look away, as if the figure had a magnetic power over him, drawing him to her, to the center of darkness that surrounded the cemetery. The whispers turned into clear and terrible words. "Luke, you are already with us. There is no escape." The voice did not come from the figure in front of him, but from the ground itself, from the wind, from the shadows around him. She was everywhere, invading your thoughts, distorting reality. He felt the roots of the earth begin to pull him, like invisible hands that dragged him down, to a dark and deep place where the light never reached. The figure, now completely in front of him, had no face, but he knew that he could see her, that she was somehow in his mind, reflecting Luke's worst fears. The shadows danced around the figure, distorted and twisted, as if they were alive, feeding on their doubt, their fear. He tried to move but failed. His body was heavy, as if the ground had become an extra weight, as if gravity had intensified. He was attached not only to the place but to the ease of that thing. The shadows approached, touching his skin with a touch cold as the abyss itself. "You belong to this place, Luke," the voice hissed, louder now. "The dead do not forget. They call you and you will come. No matter how hard you try to run, you will never be free." He didn't know what else to do. His body was paralyzed, his mind in tatters, the words echoing in his mind with force, repeating themselves, becoming a terrifying mantra. "You belong. You belong." He felt the soul moving away from the body, as if words were ripping off what was left of his sanity. It was then that the ground opened. Not literally, but the feeling was as if the earth under his feet had become a black hole, an endless void. He fell not into a well, but into a dark mist that completely enveloped him, immersed in an unbearable cold. He could no longer see anything, just felt the pressure of darkness around him. The whispers were now screams, deafening, and he could not tell whether they were human voices or something much older and more terrible. "They won't let you go, Lucas." He felt a cold hand grab his arm, and with a choked scream, tried to move away. The hand squeezed hard, almost ripping his flesh. He saw himself being pulled to the bottom, the thick fog around him compressing his lungs. He felt something touching his face, but could not see. Only heard the sound of the earth being dragged, as if the cemetery was swallowing everything around it. The ground, the trees, the tombs, all merging into a mass of shadows, shaping itself to his will. He closed his eyes, desperate, trying to resist, but something forced him to open again. When he did, he saw the shadows, or what was left of them, writhing, taking grotesque forms, like distorted faces, mouths opening in silent cries. The figures were everywhere, approaching, surrounding him, as if they were waiting, as if they were gathered around him to receive his soul. "You'll never see the sun again, Lucas. Here's where you'll stay." And then he was pulled down into the depths of the earth, to a place where time no longer existed. He didn't know where it was. There was no more the sound of night, the sound of whispers, only silence, a deep, eternal silence. Luke didn't know how long he was there. Time seemed to have lost its meaning. He felt the presence of shadows, but could not see anything. It was in a vacuum, in a state between the awake and the unconscious, where reality was distorted and sanity was disintegrated. For what seemed to be days or perhaps hours, he heard voices. He heard the sound of footsteps behind him, of someone slowly approaching. But he could not move, could not react. Every attempt to make a sound, to ask for help, was swallowed up by the darkness. "You belong here, Lucas." The voice was the same, but now it seemed more distant, deeper, as if he lived in the very walls of darkness that surrounded him. He wanted to scream, he wanted to get up, but his body was like that, trapped, unable to respond. The shadows continued to move around her, closer and closer. It was then that he saw a point of light in the distance, a small glow amid the immensity of darkness. He didn't know what it was, but felt that it was his only chance to escape. With an immense effort, he began to walk, or what seemed to be a movement, towards that light. Each step made him weaker, but he could not stop. As he approached, the light intensified, becoming brighter, until he felt the sun's warmth on his skin, something he had long forgotten. When he finally reached the light, he saw a figure before him, a woman with a gentle and serene look. "Lucas, you're not alone," she said, her voice soft as a whisper. "But you need to come back. They still wait for you." She reached out, and Lucas felt a wave of warmth and security. But when he touched her, something inside him hesitated. He couldn't just walk away, not without understanding what was happening. And at that moment, the shadows came back. They appeared from all sides, dark and grotesque, and the woman's figure disappeared. "Did you think you could run away, Lucas?" The voice hissed, now louder, more dominant. He saw himself being pulled back into the darkness, the shadows dragging him down, towards the unknown. Lucas felt the pressure of the shadows intensifying, as if they were squeezing every inch of his body, invading his mind, distorting his perception of reality. The woman's figure had disappeared, and with it his last hope of escape. He tried to shout, but his voice was lost in the darkness, swallowed by the forces that surrounded him. The shadows were now everywhere, almost physical, touching his skin, scraping against his bones, as if they wanted to tear him inside. The earth seemed alive, pulsating with a dark energy, and he felt that each step took him deeper into an endless abyss. Then something changed. It was not a physical change, but a deep feeling, as if the shadows began to gather around him, forming a consciousness of his own. He could hear your thoughts, your deepest fears, being repeated in a constant murmur, as if the very darkness knew of your innermost weaknesses. "You can't escape. You never knew, but you already belong to us." Lucas tried to fight, tried to free himself from the pressure that surrounded him, but the more he tried, the stronger it became the feeling of being consumed. He felt his mind fragment, as if it were becoming a part of the graveyard itself, a lost soul, an echo among the tombstones and shadows. Suddenly, something appeared in front of you. It was not a human figure, but a dark mass, an indistinct form that moved and trembled as if it were taking shape, but never completely. He could feel the look of that thing over him, fixed, penetrating. It was as if she was waiting for something. "Do you finally understand, Luke?" The voice echoed from all sides. "Now in your mind, no escape. There is no more salvation. The cemetery does not only hold bodies, but souls. And you are now one of them." He felt a piercing pain in his chest, as if his heart was being torn out. The darkness around him seemed to want to consume his entire soul, turn it into a shadow, a memory that would be lost with time, never remembered. He was being erased, one part of him left behind while another, a darker version of himself, took his place. In his mind, images began to appear. He saw the cemetery itself, the old and decaying graves, the dense mist that covered the ground. He saw the faces of the old people of the city, those who were buried there, but they were not really dead. They were waiting for him, waiting for more souls to be consumed. He saw himself, not more human, but a shadow, a part of the cemetery, an intangible presence, eternally bound to that place. And it was at that moment that he realized he would never leave. He was no longer Luke. He was no one else. He was only a shadow, a soul lost among the tombstones and tombs. The last vestige of his humanity was erased when darkness finally took over. The cemetery, with its shadows, with its voices, with its insatiable thirst for souls, now possessed it completely. The wind howled among the trees of the cemetery, and the shadows stretched out, dancing to the rhythm of time. There was no more Luke. There was no more a man lost in time, trying to escape the darkness. But there was something more, a presence, an unsettling feeling that the cemetery was once again waiting for something. When night fell on the city, the few residents who still dared to approach the hill of the cemetery felt a shiver, a feeling of being observed. Some swore to hear footsteps on the dirt trail leading up to the rusty iron gate. Others said they heard soft whispers, like whispers, coming from the graves. And sometimes, in darker nights when the moon did not shine, those who came too close to the cemetery could see, Among the shadows of the trees and tombstones, a slender figure without face, walking slowly between the tombs. There was no face, but there was something there, something that looked, waiting, and who looked for a long time. Maybe also heard the name whispered in the wind. And so the cycle continued. The cemetery never emptied. The shadows were always waiting for another soul, another name to whisper in the darkness.
John always knew that life was made of cycles. From a young age, he worked as a gravedigger in the city cemetery, a place that was much more than a burial ground for him. It was a shrine of memories, where the stories of those who left echoed among the leafy trees and stone tombstones. With his gray hair and the marks of concern on his face, he had learned to respect death and offer comfort to the families who were coming to pay their last respects. At home, he was a devoted father, a loving husband. Sometimes at the dinner table, he watched Mary, his wife, as she served the children, Luke, the oldest, always curious, and Anne, the youngest, with her radiant smile. The house was small but full of laughter, and John always felt grateful for having such a cozy home. That morning, however, something was different. Upon entering the funeral company manager's room, John felt a chill in his stomach. The tense expression of the man made him nervous. The words came out in a murmur as if they were a distant echo. Budget cuts. We need to lay off staff. Reality hit John like a punch in the stomach. He left the room, his heart racing as the news spread in his mind like a stain of paint on water. He had worked there for years, caring for the dead, and now he was the one facing uncertainty. The burden of responsibility towards his family has become unbearable. At the dinner table, the atmosphere was charged. He tried to keep calm, but the tension was palpable. Mary looked at him, her eyes peering for answers. "John, what happened?" she asked, the concern evident in her voice. He hesitated, knowing that the truth would be too heavy a burden for his wife to carry. "It's okay, dear. Just a hard day," he replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The silence that followed was sharp, and he knew he was lying. The pressure of accumulated bills, expenses that did not stop growing, consumed. Determined to find a new job. From that day on, Joao spent hours browsing job ads, visiting employment agencies, and facing daunting interviews. Each rejection seemed heavier than the last. One afternoon, while he was leafing through an old newspaper, a memory came to his mind. He and Maria used to dream together about the future, how they would like to travel and live in a better world. Now all that was left were the walls of the house and the shadow of worry. After weeks of searching, hope finally came. He found a job as a gravedigger in a nearby town. Felt a mixture of relief and anxiety when receiving the call. The manager proposed to work the early shift, which meant that he would have to stay away from home during the week. He negotiated weekends off so that he could come back and see his family. When he hung up the phone, a wave of hope enveloped him, but the apprehension still accompanied him. That night, as he drove to the new city, John reflected on the change he was about to face. The lights on the car's dashboard illuminated his face as he wondered if that new opportunity would be the answer to his problems. The horizon stretched out in front of him, shrouded in darkness and uncertainty, and a feeling of nervousness began to form in his chest. Finally, he saw the contours of the new city cemetery, an ancient structure surrounded by huge trees. The place seemed quiet, but a shadow of restlessness hovered in the air. John knew that life was not just made of cycles. Sometimes it pushed them into unknown paths, and now he was about to embark on one. The first night of work in the cemetery arrived, and John felt a mixture of anxiety and expectation. The cemetery, now illuminated by the dim light of the moon, had a gloomy beauty. The trees seemed to whisper ancient secrets, and the tombstones, with their worn inscriptions, kept stories that time had tried to erase. John remembered the words of his former colleague, "Souls never rest completely." When he arrived, he was received by Carlos, the man responsible for maintaining the cemetery. Carlos, a robust man with a low voice, welcomed him and explained the evening's tasks. "The rounds are simple, Joao. Just make sure everything is in order and keep the lights on. Silence can be confusing, but don't worry. Just follow your routine." While Carlos spoke, Joao felt a chill in his spine. He always worked during the day, surrounded by lives and laughter. Now the cemetery seemed a new entity, alive in a way that made him uneasy. When he said goodbye to Charles, John realized the loneliness that awaited him. As soon as the moon rose in the sky, John began his rounds. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own footsteps on the damp grass. He strove to concentrate on his work, but a sense of being watched hovered in the air. The shadows of the trees danced in the moonlight, and every noise seemed amplified, a branch breaking in the distance, the rustling of leaves. The tombstones, with their angular shapes, seemed to project sad and desperate faces, and John could not help feeling uncomfortable. He took a deep breath and remembered his family, how much he needed this job. During his tour, he reached the oldest wing of the cemetery, where the tombstones were covered with moss and the inscriptions almost unreadable. Suddenly, a cold breeze blew, causing a shiver to run through his spine. Then he noticed something that made his heart go up. A tombstone was half open. Pressing the lantern, John approached, hesitant. The surrounding earth was loose, and a feeling of dread took hold of him. With his heart racing, he bent down to investigate. This can't be real, he thought, forcing himself to believe that maybe it was just an illusion caused by the loneliness of the night. He looked around, trying to find some explanation. It must be a maintenance left behind, he was convinced. But as the gravestone opened, the darkness seemed to intensify, as if something was hiding there, waiting. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, the headstone was again closed, as if it had never been touched. Feeling ashamed, John moved away, fear taking over his body. He decided it was time to return to his routine. However, the voices he had heard in the wind now seemed more insistent, whispering secrets that he could not understand. Weeks passed, and the silence of the cemetery became a constant in John's life. He continued to hear strange noises, footsteps that did not belong to him, whispers that dissipated as he tried to approach. Every night, he wondered if he had made the right decision to take that job. On the third week of work, in a particularly dense night, he heard distant giggles. The sound was cheerful and childish, but it did not belong to this world. John turned around, trying to locate the source of the noise, but there was no one in sight. The fog enveloped the cemetery, obscuring its vision and making the environment even more sinister. When he turned to turn back, something caught his attention on the periphery of the cemetery. A small figure stood between the tombstones, looking at him. A little girl with shaggy hair and a white dress that seemed to shine in the moonlight watched him with big innocent eyes. John felt his heart racing. The little girl smiled, and he was paralyzed, stuck between fear and curiosity. He approached slowly, but as soon as he made a movement, the child disappeared as if it were made of smoke. He blinked, incredulous, and felt that the line between the real and the supernatural was beginning to unravel. Desperate, he walked away, trying to rationalize what he had just seen. It was just an illusion, he repeated to himself, but the feeling that something was watching him did not disappear. Fear and loneliness began to corrode him from within, causing him to question not only his sanity, but also his ability to continue in that work. Upon returning to his post, a new understanding began to form in his mind. The cemetery was not only a resting place for the dead, but a space where souls roamed, waiting for someone to see them. He needed to face his fears, and the presence of that little girl, strange and sad, began to occupy his thoughts. The nights in the cemetery became a mixture of terror and curiosity. John could not stop thinking about the little girl. What did she want from him? Why was she there? Every time he entered the cemetery, the feeling that something was watching him followed him, like a persistent shadow. However, he could not afford to give up. He needed that job for his family. The memory of the faces of Mary, Luke, and Anna kept him moving even when darkness seemed to swallow his courage. After a few more restless nights, John decided he needed to understand what was happening. With a heavy heart and determination beating in his veins, he began to research the history of the cemetery. Spoke with the locals and heard rumors about a tragedy that had occurred years ago, a child who mysteriously disappeared while playing near the cemetery. The information was scarce, but John managed to find out that the little girl was called Laura. His spirit, according to local legends, still roamed the cemetery in search of company. John's heart sank upon hearing of that child's sadness, and a wave of empathy enveloped him. One night, while he was making his rounds, he saw a glow coming from one of the tombstones. As he approached, he realized that it was the gravestone of Laura, a small tomb adorned with faded flowers. The writing was almost erased, but you could still read, "Laura, the child who never came home." A knot formed in his throat, and he sat down next to the tombstone, thinking about the interrupted life of that girl. As he gazed at the headstone, the wind softly blew, and he felt a chill rising up his spine. The atmosphere changed. The shadows seemed to stretch, and a sense of presence began to envelop him again. He closed his eyes and muttered, "Laura, are you here?" At that moment, a slight touch on his hand made him open his eyes. The little girl was there, with her white fluttering dress and a sad smile. Her eyes looked deep, filled with sadness. John felt a strange connection, as if she was asking for help. "Laura, why can't you rest?" he asked, his voice failing. The little girl looked at him, her gaze intense, but there were no words. Instead, she reached out her hand as if she wanted him to follow her. John hesitated, but curiosity and compassion drove him to go with her. Laura's figure began to move toward a more isolated part of the cemetery. He followed her, feeling his heart accelerate with each step. Finally, she stopped in front of an old tree, its branches twisted as if embracing the space. The little girl pointed to the ground, where the grass looked greener and more vibrant than anywhere else. John crouched down and began to remove the earth with his hands. With each handful of land he moved away, fear and excitement were mixed. Then he found a small wooden box, worn by time. With a tremor in his hands, he opened it. Inside, there was a collection of old toys and a miniature diary with yellowed pages. Laura's words were there, a report of her life before the disappearance, full of laughter and games, but also of fears and loneliness. John remembered his own children and the innocence that is lost so quickly in life. He closed the diary, feeling that he had discovered something valuable. Laura was not just stuck in the cemetery, she was stuck in her memories, and those memories were full of love and pain. Suddenly, the wind blew with force, causing the leaves to dance and the climate changed. Laura's figure began to fade slowly, but not before she looked directly into John's eyes. He felt a wave of sadness and compassion. With one last whisper, she seemed to ask him to help give her the rest that she did not have. John stood up, determined to bring the story of Laura to light. He could not leave her trapped there in a place that should be peace. With the toy box and the diary in hand, he realized that he had a mission, to help free the soul of that child, and thus find peace for his own life and his family. Determined to give Laura the rest she deserved, John began to investigate what could be done. He realized that the first step would be to honor the memory of the girl and bring her belongings to the surface. Those memories were buried with her, and it was time to give them the visibility they deserved. The next morning, he talked to the townspeople and sought out more information about Laura and her family. He found out that the girl had disappeared for a summer day, and his family had never recovered from the loss. They moved soon after, leaving behind an empty house and a deep pain. With the information he collected, John decided that the best way to honor Laura would be to organize a ceremony of homage in her name. He planned to bring together the community and the few friends that the girl had. Maybe by doing that we can give Laura the goodbye she never had, he thought. In the days that followed, John worked tirelessly. He prepared the ceremony, decorated the place with flowers and candles, and organized a small display of the toys that he had found in the box. He also included the diary, which he had decided to read aloud during the ceremony, sharing Laura's story with everyone. On the night of the memorial, the cemetery was lit by lanterns and surrounded by flowers. The locals began to arrive, and the mood was filled with expectation and sadness. John felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, but also a light of hope. As soon as the ceremony began, João stood before Laura's tombstone, surrounded by familiar and foreign faces. He took a deep breath, holding the diary in his trembling hands, and began to read aloud. Laura's words echoed in the silent night, filling the space with laughter, dreams, and also a deep sadness. As he read, the eyes of those present were moistened. João saw the pain reflected on their faces and realized that the memory of Laura still burned alive in his memories. He began to speak about the importance of honoring those who have departed and remembering that their souls still roam among us. When he finished reading, he put the diary back in the box along with the toys. In a symbolic gesture, he invited everyone to join him in a moment of silence in honor of the little girl who never had a goodbye. The moment silence was established, something extraordinary happened. The breeze intensified, and a soft light began to shine around Laura's tombstone. The present were speechless as an ethereal figure began to emerge from the ground, the little girl that John had seen in previous nights. Laura was there, brighter than ever, with her white dress shining in the moonlight. She looked at John with a smile, and he felt a wave of love and gratitude. The sadness and suffering that once held her captive now seemed to dissipate. Laura reached out again, and this time John did not hesitate. He followed her, feeling the connection between them to strengthen. As they walked together, the light emanates from the tombstone and the spirit of the little girl grew, illuminating the whole cemetery. When the light finally intensified, John was sure that it was time for Laura. With a last look at him, the little girl said goodbye, and in doing so, a wave of peace enveloped the place. The attendees felt a deep relief, and silence was replaced by a feeling of serenity. After that night, the atmosphere in the cemetery changed. John no longer felt the disturbing presence that accompanied him before. Instead, a sense of peace reigned, and he realized that Laura had finally found her rest. John continued to work in the cemetery, now not only as a gravedigger but as a keeper of memories. He decided that every weekend would return to his home, not only to see his family, but also to keep alive the memory of Laura and all those who were buried there. Laura's story spread through the city, and people began to visit the cemetery, taking flowers and souvenirs. John's life changed forever that night, and he learned that even in the shadows of loss, the light of memory and compassion could always prevail. The days that followed Laura's homage brought a new routine to João. He felt lighter, as if a weight had been taken off his shoulders. The tranquility in the cemetery was a reflection of the relief he felt, and Laura's presence had now become a warm reminder rather than a source of fear. As the weeks went by, the cemetery became a meeting place for the community. People started coming more often, not only to pay tribute to their loved ones, but also to reflect and share stories. João observed the children playing between the tombstones, laughter echoing in the air, a soft melody that replaced the oppressive silence that once dominated that space. He started to organize small events, such as night walks with stories about the inhabitants of the cemetery and the story of Laura. He told about his life, his hopes and dreams, transforming the place into a space of learning and reflection. Families came together, sharing their own stories of loss and love, and this began to heal the wounds that hurt so much. In quiet nights, João still sat at Laura's tombstone, talking to her as if she were a close friend. He told me about his family, his children, and how he was striving to be a better father. It was as if Laura became a part of his life, a source of strength that guided him through difficult times. One day, as he looked at the headstone of Laura adorned with fresh flowers, he realized that his life had changed in a profound way. He had found a renewed purpose in his work, not only as a gravedigger but as a storyteller. He began to collect the memories of other families who had lost their loved ones, creating an archive of stories that could be shared with future generations. Laura's impact extended beyond the graveyard. João became more involved with the community, helping to organize events and campaigns to raise funds for care at the cemetery. He began to see space as a place of life, a place where stories could continue to be told, where memory could flourish instead of withering away. Gradually, sadness turned into hope. He saw the power of human connection and the importance of honoring the memories of those who left. Each tombstone has become a symbol of love, and every visit has become a celebration of life. On a sunny morning, John decided it was time to repay. He organized an event in memory of Laura, inviting the community to plant a tree in her name. It would be a symbol of growth and rebirth, a reminder that even in the shadows, light would always find a way to shine. During the ceremony, everyone gathered around the newly planted tree. João spoke about Laura and the transformation she brought to her life and community. People shared their own stories of loss and recovery, and the cemetery resounded with laughter and tears of joy. As everyone gathered around the tree, a gentle breeze blew in, and John felt as if Laura was there, smiling at him. He realized that it would always be present, not as a sad memory, but as a beacon of hope and renewal. In the following months, John's life stabilized. He found a balance between working at the cemetery and spending time with his family. He taught Luke and about the importance of honoring people's memories, of remembering that even after death, stories continue to live. And so, in a small cemetery in the city, the story of a little girl named Laura became a legacy of love, hope, and compassion. John not only learned to accept loss, but also to celebrate life, finding beauty in the memories and connection that everyone shares. Over time, the impact of the tree planted in memory of Laura spread throughout the community. Residents began to come to the cemetery not only to honor their loved ones, but also to connect with each other. The small space has become a haven of peace and reflection. John realized that the tree had become a symbol of renewal and hope. He organized monthly meetings around it, where people could share stories, bring flowers, or simply sit in silence, remembering those who had left. The cemetery, once seen as a place of sadness, was now a space for union and celebration of life. During these meetings, João became a storyteller, reporting the life of Laura and others who rested there. He encouraged people to talk about their own lost loves, creating a cycle of mutual support. Tears were often accompanied by laughter, and the memories they shared helped heal wounds that seemed impossible to heal. One night, while John was doing his usual rounds, he noticed a figure sitting under Laura's tree. He approached cautiously and recognized one of the city's residents, an older man named Antonio, who had always been reserved and distant. "Hi, Antonio. All right?" John asked, noticing the sadness in the man's eyes. "I was thinking of my daughter," Antonio replied, his voice low and trembling. "She's been gone for a few years and I never got to say goodbye, right?" John sat down next to him, feeling the pain that emanated from the man. "You know, I went through it too. I believe everyone here has a story to tell. If you want, you can join us at the next meeting." Anthony hesitated, but the light of the tree illuminated his face as he pondered. Eventually, he decided to attend the meeting. John was impressed to see how his presence began to bring other residents who were also struggling with their losses. That night, under the stars and the soft light of the tree, Antonio told the story of his daughter. The words came out of his heart, and as he spoke, a weight seemed to be lifted from his shoulders. The empathy and solidarity of the community involved him, creating a safe space for his pain. John noted that this act of sharing stories had a positive effect not only on Anthony, but on everyone present. People began to open up with each other, forming ties that did not exist before. The cemetery became a place of collective healing, where pain was understood and validated. The meetings became a tradition, and each meeting included a new story. Joao felt inspired to write these stories, documenting the memories that emerged. He wanted to create a book that could be shared with future generations, preserving each one's story and the importance of remembering. As the seasons passed, Joao began to feel Laura's presence in subtle ways, as if she was smiling at him in every flower that sprouted around the tree. The atmosphere of joy and acceptance in the cemetery had become a reflection of his spirit. He often felt a gentle breeze when he spoke about her, as if the little girl was thanking him for what he had done. One night, as he was finishing another meeting, John looked at the tree and in a moment of inspiration decided to create a space for children who had lost someone. He wanted these young people to know that they were not alone in their pain and that their stories were also important. Joao worked with the community to transform a small area near the tree into a space dedicated to children. He introduced toys, books, and a small fountain, creating an environment where they could play and share their experiences. The space became a sanctuary of hope and renewal, where everyone's memories could live in harmony. Through pain and loss, John found a greater purpose. He learned that love does not fade with death, but lives in every memory, in every shared laugh, in every story told. The tree, which began as a symbol of sadness, now bloomed as a beacon of hope, illuminating the hearts of all who gathered around it. And so, in the small cemetery of the city, Laura's story continued to be told, not just as a story of loss, but as a celebration of life and community power.